What's up, YouTube? My name's Thomas. Thanks for coming to the channel today. Today we are going to be looking at the backstory of Rhett from the Rhett and Link Good Mythical Morning Show. I guess he used to be a pretty staunch Christian, and for some reason he's chosen to walk away from that. And I am really curious to see why and have a discussion about it. So stick around.
You go from, so at some point you go from not just Christian, but really involved, professional Christian, as you put it, to now where you are. Where does this start?
That's such an interesting term, professional Christian. I think a lot of people within the churches nowadays are becoming professional Christians. And let's see how he defines it, because I don't like that term in the way that I define it in my head.
So in my early 20s, the first couple of years out of school, I'm an engineer, civil engineer. I'm still very involved in Campus Crusade at the time. I'm not having that many, existential questions about it. If anything, I'm thinking about how I'm moving towards being a professional Christian.
That's interesting. I grew up in the church, what felt like I was at church every fruit fly in here. I grew up at church probably what felt like 5 or 6 days out of the week, nonstop. Like Monday night is Boy Scouts at church, Tuesday nights like youth group at church, Wednesday nights men's group at church, Thursday is schooling group at church, Saturday night service, Sunday morning service. And for him to say that he actually didn't have any existential questions at that point is very interesting to me. Sorry, the stupid fruit fly. I can remember back when I was 11, 12, 13 years old, having like existential crises in regards to religion and Christianity. I remember sitting in sermon after sermon after sermon and wondering about so many things, even at that age. So I'm very curious. I don't know what age Rhett got involved in the church. Let's keep going.
Existential questions about it. If anything, I'm thinking about how I'm moving towards being a professional Christian, because my wife was still in college at the time. And so Link and I had we'd been best friends since first grade, 1984. So we kind of knew what we were working towards. And the idea that we were going to develop this ministry where we got to be funny and make our comedy videos. And we were really trying to find a way to do the thing that we loved for the cause that we loved.
So it sort of started as with God in the periphery here, of like with all the video stuff, and it's all sort of directed towards, at least subtly to some degree, evangelism.
When you're involved in the church, especially at a young age, I'm not necessarily saying this is a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I whether you're directly told this and taught this or not, I feel like quite often you have this feeling within yourself, whether it was because of the things that the pastor was preaching to you or just because of your own personal situation, that everything you do needs to be done for God, right? And I think a lot of that comes from, these pastors in these churches preaching that to do everything you do as if you were doing it for the Lord. If you're going to serve others, do it as if you're serving the Lord. If you're going to go to work as if you're working for God. And I think in general, that can be a positive thing, but it really can cause a lot of burnout within the religion and within Christianity, because you feel like you can't even get up in the morning and drink a cup of coffee without thinking, oh my God, this is a lot of caffeine. Am I treating my body well enough for God? And I think for some people, not everybody, but for some people, it can cause a lot of anxiety within yourself, that you're going, oh my goodness, you're micromanaging and examining your own actions every single day, every word that comes out of your mouth. And there can be a positive side to that, but it can also feel very negative, where it can cause a lot of anxiety to build up within you. I wanted to play music when I was young. All I cared about in the entire world was playing music. I played guitar 5-6 hours a day. I sang as often as I could. I was constantly, the fastest way that I could get involved in playing music ended up being playing for a church. And the first time I played for a church, I think I was probably like 12 or 13 years old. And when I got to the point that I could finally get into a band, I felt as though I couldn't write any lyrics or any songs unless they were specifically about God and about Jesus. And whether you believe in God or you don't believe in God, I think it's really important to remember that if God is real and if he is a good God, I don't think, let's say the music, for example, God's not going to be mad at you because you wrote a song about a breakup that you went through, because that may help your heart heal. And God gives you the talents and the passions and the things that you have for a reason. So if you decide, you know what, I'm painting paintings, and last 15 paintings I painted were for Jesus, but I really want to paint the neighbor's house because it's so beautiful, but no, it's not about God. I think it's okay. The Lord I would hope that if God is real and he is a good God, that he would want to see you happy and enjoy those things.
Here of like with all the video stuff, and it's all sort of directed towards, at least subtly to some degree, evangelism.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was a way to have my cake and eat it too, because I really wanted, like, we are entertainers at heart. We wanted to be filmmakers. We wanted to make things that, had significance culturally. We wanted to do that from the very beginning. So we always had our minds of like on this idea that maybe we'll kind of, we can we can use this ministry, or we can have a ministry where we're doing these things that we love, and then maybe something that we make will be impactful enough so that we could one day, maybe we'll move to Hollywood and maybe we'll have a ministry there just through the things that we create. That was sort of the thought in the early days. So shortly after the engineering stint, go on staff with Campus Crusade. At that point, you're going to the staff training and you're taking the seminary classes and your initial, and I was always I was not like a super deep student of theology, but I would say moderately deep. And there were certain ideas that I would gravitate towards and things that I like to think about and talk about. At that same time, I was given a book, and I never really thought about the intersection of science and faith. I think the way that I would have described it is, I think that most scientists are not Christians. Most scientists are atheists, and they've come up with some pretty wacky ideas to try to explain the world and why people are the way that they are, why the world is the way that it is. And they're mostly just desperate attempts to explain the world without God's involvement. Mm-hmm. So that whole thing about evolution and how long the world has been here, that's probably all BS. But I didn't think about it any more deeply than that. Mm-hmm. I wasn't like a staunch younger.
This is one of the most dangerous things about being involved in any religion. It doesn't matter what kind of religion it is. And it's not just religion. This includes politics. This includes morality. This includes religion. It includes anything, really, is just taking what you're told when you're young at face value. You can't just take exactly what you're told and then just go, well, that's what I was told. That's what I was taught. I'm supposed to be a Christian, and, my pastor said this. So if I question it, well, I must just be a bad Christian. Or if you're a kid and, my parents were Republicans, so I guess I'm going to be Republican, or Democrat, so I guess I'm going to be a Democrat. And this can go into any religion, any sect of politics, any sect of morality or moral beliefs, whether it's tied to religion or politics or anything across the board. I think one of the things that, whether you're in like a religious side of the world or a secular side of the world, that both of them are failing our children at the same rate, is we are not teaching our children to think for themselves. If you are involved in a Christian church and you are a leader in that Christian church and you truly believe, or any religion, and you truly believe deep down and within yourself that that religion is true and provable, then you should be teaching those young kids what you believe is true and provable, but then also teaching them to test it. I'm not saying, test God, test this, test. But what I'm saying is that if you believe that Christianity is testable and provable, then you can teach those children to think for themselves, because if they do choose to think for themselves and question what they hear, then they will ultimately come to the same conclusion you did if it's true. The same thing goes for parents with politics, with religion, with morality, with anything. If you are not teaching your children to think for themselves, that doesn't mean that, well, I'm a parent and I'm a atheist and a Democrat, and I want my kids to be that way, or I'm pro-life and Catholic, and I want my kids to believe that. That's fine. You can teach your kids the general things that you believe in, but I myself, as a parent, believe that it's important for me to teach my daughters to think for themselves, and that, this is what your daddy believes. These are the reasons that your daddy thinks that these things are true, but what do you think about this? That doesn't mean that I am saying to let your children do whatever they want. No, of course not. That would just be complete chaos and anarchy. I'm not saying that, well, you know what? It's wrong to hit people, but what do you think about this? Well, that kid made me mad at elementary school, Dad, so I slapped him. No, that's wrong, right? And we're going to stand on our ground as parents about what we believe is right and what we believe is wrong. I am not telling you that you need to teach your children or teach kids in church to question you and to be disrespectful towards authority. But what I am saying is that if you are raising a child, whether it be religious or non-religious, but since we're talking about religion, let's just use that as an example. If you're raising a child in the church and within your home to believe the same religious beliefs as you, but you don't teach them to question those things, then when they become adults and they go out into the world, how are they going to be able to defend their beliefs? Because what's going to happen is the moment that they go out into the real world and they go out and experience these types of things and other people questioning what you've taught them growing up, all that's going to happen is their arguments and beliefs within their head that you instilled in them are going to fall apart immediately. Whereas if you can teach them to question things and to look into things and to think for themselves, they can already have exercised the doubts that they had out of their own head. And when somebody else approaches them later in life with questions or concerns or an opposite viewpoint, they will have the ability to defend themselves.
To explain the world without God's involvement. So that whole thing about evolution and how long the world has been here, that's probably all BS. But I didn't think about it any more deeply than that. I wasn't like a staunch young earth creationist. I didn't think about that issue in particular.
Sure.
But I picked up a book from an astronomer, Hugh Ross. And I'm sure, I've mentioned this before, and he has a Christian ministry that is like very anti-evolution, but very pro old universe from the standpoint of astronomy, which obviously when you look at all the astronomical evidence and the speed of light and the size of the universe and all this stuff, okay, the universe has been around for probably as long as the scientists are saying. But then he went on to essentially say that, but all truth is God's truth, and this is totally compatible with the Bible.
One of the toughest things about religion is that there are so many different sects, especially within Christianity, because Christianity is the religion that's been around the longest. And the most obvious form of this is you have Catholics and Protestants and Christians and Methodists and all of these different sects, right? But even within a specific denomination, like the non-denominational, which I like that the Christians call themselves non-denominational, like we're not like everyone else, but that is their denomination, is that they're non-denominational. But even within, let's say, the non-denominational Christian church, there are Christians that believe that the earth is 7,500 years old. There are Christians that believe the earth is 15,000 years old. There are Christians that believe that it is hundreds of billions of years old, even within that one denomination or sect of the Christian religion. I think one of the most important things to make a distinction and a note of is when it comes to evolution and Christianity, is that whether you believe or you don't believe, there is two different types, mainly to dumb it down to a very elementary level. There are two different types of evolution. There is what is called macroevolution, and there is what's called microevolution. Now, macroevolution is the belief that one single cellular organism made of one cell, floating out in the universe or in a mud puddle somewhere, can slowly over billions and billions of years evolve itself up to a tadpole and then a whatever and then a monkey and then a human. From one cell all the way up to this massive creature. That's macroevolution. Macro just being the root word for large or extreme. Massive, essentially. Now, that is essentially considered what would be Darwinism. And Darwin himself, the father of macroevolutionistic beliefs, he even said on his deathbed that he took all of it back. He said he did not believe that it could be possibly true. Now, there are a lot, that belief has still become very popular and spread throughout the world, and there's a lot of people that believe in that. But microevolution is disprovably true. You cannot disprove Microevolution. Microevolution is that organisms change and evolve in a very small manner based upon certain things that happen. For example, macroevolution might believe that because a creature lived out in the Sahara Desert for 100 million years, that creature developed scales and tougher skin just based on its environment. Whereas microevolution would be the belief that when a mother and a father come together and have children, certain sections of that DNA from the mother will affect the child, and certain sections from the father affect the child, and that child changes. It's not its mother, it's not its father. It is changed into this new creature. That is microevolution at its roots. Now, Christianity and macroevolution do not mix, because you cannot believe that God formed human beings and created them human beings if you also believe that human beings came from a single cell. But microevolution would essentially be, if you are a Christian and within the Christian religion, microevolution would be considered what God put within us. Microevolution would be what God created us as. It's in our DNA, and it's the small changes that can happen, which can add up to large changes over time. You can have one bloodline that is a certain race and ethnicity that 5 generations down the road is a completely different race and ethnicity. That's microevolution. So as macroevolution and Christianity don't necessarily mix, microevolution and Christianity pretty much go hand in hand together.
But then he went on to essentially say that, but all truth is God's truth, and this is totally compatible with the Bible. But just so you know, evolution didn't happen. He was a proponent of something called progressive creationism, which essentially was, yes, the world has been around for as long as the scientists say.
Right.
And these fossils we find are legitimate fossils that are approximately the date that they're saying they are. But God was creating new batches of creatures, special creations at different stages throughout the history of the world.
Whoa.
And then ultimately resulting in the creation of people.
So why?
Great question. Great question. So
That's so strange to me, and that seems very much so not what the Bible says. I mean, you can pretty much just read Genesis 1, and it makes it very clear what Christians should believe, I guess, if you choose to be one, as to how creation was made. Now, where this can get complicated is in Genesis, it has a creation story based upon a 7-day timeline. And in the Bible, it calls them 7 days. On the first day, God created this and that. On the second day, God created this and that. It goes through the whole thing until he goes through the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and the creatures in the land, and then human beings, and then on the 7th day God rested, which is where we get the idea of the Sabbath, that on the 7th day we should rest. Now, there are a lot of, again, sects within certain denominations or several denominations within Christianity that believe that day cycle that is stated within the Bible wasn't an actual day, that they believe that whether it be because the root word, Greek of that word points towards this and that actually meant it was 100 million years or X, Y, and Z. And a lot of people will use those things to say a day was actually this many years or this many decades or this many whatever. And what Christians will do is they will use that to point out that, oh, well, evolution is true, and he just created things at a different time throughout, and there was this much space in between, and that's why the earth is hundreds of billions of years old.
I remember thinking, as I'm reading this, I'm like, it's the first time I ever thought about there being some reconciliation between what we observe in science and my belief about the world. And I just remember thinking, this doesn't feel like a good explanation.
I've never heard of somebody. I mean, I'm sure I've met someone who probably believes that the Earth is old and the universe is old, but maybe is suspicious of evolution. But specifically, well, I'm a scientist and I'm an astronomer, and there's just no way I can look at the redshifting of the galaxies and deny that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. But that evolution stuff from that other field of biology that I've probably never really seriously studied, that's all BS. And instead, I mean, God is just creating animals.
The problem, you got to think for yourself and
willy-nilly.
do research.
And there's animals that are getting more and more like a person before the people.
Yeah, it's like God is just sort of doing little trial runs or something.
Right. I mean, what does that say about God is what I was thinking.
Yeah, it gets there eventually. That is a little bit a little bit strange. I suppose it's kind of biblical in the sense of like stretching out the story of Genesis over however long you needed, and animals sort of popping in on different days and stuff like this. But yeah, I mean, the biggest problem for me that evolution poses to the Christian, and a lot of Christians today just accept evolution. They're like, yeah, sure, humans all have a common ancestor with other animals. The biggest problem that I think it poses is the seeming like arbitrariness with which you have to say that, presuming that our apish ancestors don't get to inherit eternal life. At some point, a mother gives birth to a child, and the child is morally condemnable to hell, but also potentially has the ability to inherit eternal life, but his mother doesn't.
Right.
And what the difference is there. And maybe it's just a brute fact. Maybe God just breathed life into that particular organism, but it just seems a bit arbitrary and unfair.
Yeah.
That is a really great point I've never thought of before, is that if macroevolution is true, the idea that we evolved from one single cell through all these different, turning into many different creatures until we eventually became humans, the Bible makes it very clear that there's a distinction between human beings and animals. The Bible nowhere says that you should be cruel to animals or mistreat animals or anything like that. In fact, it says quite the opposite. When Adam is made in Genesis, God puts him in charge over the land. And I think that there is an expectation of, maybe I'm reading into it too much, but to me, if you're put in charge over the beasts of the land and the birds of the sky, that there is a certain unspoken understanding that you need to be responsible with those things. God preaches love and care throughout the Bible completely. But if macroevolution is true and those monkeys are actually your ancestors, at what point is it that you go to heaven and the monkeys don't? It's a really interesting thought.
And what the difference is there. And maybe it's just a brute fact. Maybe God just breathed life into that particular organism, but it just seems a bit arbitrary and unfair. That person's suffering will now be redeemed and it now means something. But their mothers, who is the same organism, same suffering, same lifestyle, same everything, dies like an animal. It just doesn't seem right to me. Yeah. Unless you want to say that personhood is something which develops as well, but that gets you into a whole lot of trouble. With
and so that's where I ended up going, right? Because when I didn't really buy into the progressive creationism thing, but I was so sure that evolution didn't happen. I was like, when you're raised in the Christian faith, and the only exposure to the idea of evolution you've ever had has come through the filter of a Christian scientist telling you why it's not legitimate. You know, somebody comes into your church and they're like the evolution expert, and they're like, they make it seem so impossible that you walk out of that with the full affirmation of the idea that evolution definitely didn't happen. And it's a horrible explanation. It will be debunked by the scientists themselves within our lifetime. Like, that's the kind of stuff that we told ourselves, right?
Right.
And we firmly believed it. But because of this proposal, this progressive creationist idea, because the age of the universe and the age of the earth, from a geological, I've always been interested in geology, but from a geological standpoint, I was like, oh, well, this is inescapable. Like, this isn't, like, the way that Answers in Genesis has framed this issue is, I mean, I'm not going to say it's definitely disingenuous. I think they really just believe that it has to, you know, be consistent with the Bible, and so they're just willing to just completely reshape everything that they're seeing in light of that. But I essentially was like, well, this doesn't make any sense. So then the idea of considering evolution, which just felt, I was like, am I actually about to do this? And I was like, well, I think C.S. Lewis believed in evolution. You know, you start saying these things like, but there's a lot of Christians who are like theistic evolutionists. And okay, so maybe there's something to this. So I read Francis Collins' book, The Language of God.
Language of God.
And the thing that I took away from that book was that, well, evolution happened as well. And, you know, he touches on it a little bit. He talks about, in that book, I think he talks about the second chromosome, the fusing of the second chromosome. I think he talks a little bit about retroviruses, and essentially, you know, we've got the marks of the same retroviruses on our DNA that chimpanzees do. And there are just these, again,
See, this is the tough part about Christianity versus evolution. For example, when he's saying that there are the same marks of the retroviruses in our DNA that chimpanzees do, you could use that in an evolutionistic standpoint to say that that is something that proves evolution. And what the Christians say is that that is the mark of God, that God created human beings and he created chimpanzees. So, of course, you would see similarities, right? When it comes to the age of the earth and all of the different layers that you see in within rock and within mountains that there are certain thousands of years per layer of this type of material that they use to age the earth. What Christians believe is that God could have created it that way. Or there are other Christians that believe that, when the flood happened, that caused a lot of sediment to quickly, crumple and harden in order to make these layers that would have normally taken hundreds of millions of years to make. But because of this massive flood in the Bible, that's what caused it. It's there. The interesting thing to me is whether you choose to believe in Christianity or you choose to believe in atheism, both of them involve faith, because none of us were there, right? And so you have to experience your own journey, make your own journey, do your own research, think for yourself, look into atheism, look into Christianity, look into everything, and make your own decision. Because if you choose to believe in evolution, let's go back to the core belief of evolution, which would be the Big Bang theory, that there was nothing, and then one day, boom, there was a massive explosion, there was a big bang, and everything was created from that point. And over hundreds of billions of years, that with everything colliding and smashing against each other, that stars were formed and planets were formed, and this little cell on one planet that later would be called Earth evolved into what we are today. Well, what caused the Big Bang? Where did everything come from? But it goes down to the exact same thing with Christianity, where there was nothing, and then God said, let there be light, let there be this, let there be that. And over the course of 7 days, he created everything that exists. But then it's the same question, well, where did God come from? So whether you choose that direction or this direction, faith is involved. You can't just be a Christian and say that, oh, well, everybody else is wrong. And you can't just be an atheist and say, well, everybody else is wrong. You can't just make a decision that you're right, everyone else is wrong, because the reality is, more than likely, you're wrong about something. Even if you're a Christian and you're right about Christianity, that it's the true one religion, I guarantee you there are things about it that you think are true and you're wrong. And even if you're an atheist and atheism is true, I guarantee there are things about how we came to light or came to exist over time that, even though you may be right about your core beliefs, if they are true, you could be wrong about things along the way. So we all have to get to a point as a community and as a group that we can all accept that this is what I believe, this is what you believe. I believe that I could be wrong about certain things, you believe that you could be wrong about certain things. And only when we have that attitude can we come together, have a discussion, and maybe learn from each other.
There's no way that chimpanzees do. And
Right.
there are just these, again, there's no other way to see it.
Just like inexplicable data.
Right. It's like if we're not related to every other animal on Earth, well, God certainly tried to make it seem like we are.
Yeah.
And so then that was a huge moment for me. I remember coming home, still living in North Carolina. Again, a lot of people think that the story that is often told is that Link and I were Christians. We came to Los Angeles. We were corrupted by this sinful city, and we threw away our faith. And the reality, and I've told it many times, but it's passed over, is that all this happened when I was in North Carolina.
Right.
This happened when I was completely buckled into the Bible Belt as tightly as you can be, surrounded by people who agree with me about all these things, with no social pressure to deviate from that at all. In fact, a lot of social pressure to stay in the fold.
Opposite.
So I was struggling a lot because I didn't have anybody to talk to about this.
Yeah.
I remember talking to Link. I talked to Link about it a little bit, and he would just kind of be like, "Oh, shit!" Like it felt like you're learning a lot of things that seem problematic, but I'm not going to I don't want to think about this.
Yeah.
Jessie, my wife,
I think that's one of the biggest issues, and I'm not specifically attacking Link here. I'm sure Link is a fantastic guy, but within the church, quite often when you bring things up, that is the attitude. Is like, oh no, you're going down a bad path. I'm going to pray for you, and but yet, why aren't you thinking about these things? And I'm not saying that these things should prove Christianity wrong. Maybe you go down this path and find that you now have more faith than you ever did before. But don't be that Christian or that atheist or that Democrat or that Republican that when you hear something that goes against your own beliefs, you go, well, I don't like that. I'm not going to think about it. Think about it, explore it, and discover, because you may find that you are wrong about something, or you may find solid proof that is going to solidify your beliefs beyond any doubt that you had before. Explore, think for yourself.
Shit, like it felt like you're learning a lot of things that seem problematic, but I'm not going to think of. I don't want to think about this.
Yeah.
Jessie, my wife, who did come from like a young Earth creationist background, like that's that's what she was taught growing up. When I came home and I was like, we need to talk about something, and I said, I am thoroughly convinced that evolution is true and that we are related to every other animal. I believe in common ancestry. And I just think that it is
What a difficult conversation to have.
I sort of think it's true. It's just like my reading has led me to think that if this isn't true, then I actually can't determine what anything that's true. It's so overwhelming. Because I had read additionally to that, she just starts crying.
Always make sure that when you're exploring an idea that you explore both sides, right? Because, and I'm not saying that Rhett is incorrect here, but if you only explore the evolutionary side of things, then you're going to read all of the reasons that they believe that it is true. And it could convince you in a wrong direction. But if you only explore the Christian side of things, you're going to read books from people that believe it's true and read every single reason that they believe it's true. And it could convince you in the wrong direction. You have to approach things from a non-biased perspective and explore both directions and both angles of things so that you can come to an agreement within yourself, so that you can find peace of what do I believe. I've heard this side, and sometimes it's more than two. Sometimes you got to read many sides to things, and you can take all of those ideas and all of those things and bring them to the center of yourself and find peace by going, I understand, I've explored every direction I could have possibly explored. I've heard every idea and theory about these things, and this is the conclusion I choose to come to.
She just starts crying because she knew what this represented.
Right.
This was this seismic shift. And I think a lot of people that I tell this story to are like, what do you mean? But there's all these Christians that believe in evolution. Like, I can't believe that this was so significant for you. But I think the reason it was is because at that point, I realized how wrong I could be about something so fundamental.
Yeah.
And I never, ever considered that I might.
There's an interesting saying that I've heard, that the people that you meet in life that act all puffed up and think that they know everything are usually the dumbest people. And the people that think that they know nothing and they're humble and they just think down on themselves are usually the smarter ones. And the reason that is because smart people do so much research and so much schooling and so much education around whatever subject that they're smart about, that the more that they learn, the more they realize is out there, which brings them to this realization that they know nothing. It's like, oh my gosh, I thought I knew so much. And the more that I learn and the more that I research, the more that I read, the more discussions that I have, the more I come to the conclusion and realization, I have no idea what's going on. Like, there is so much more on this subject for me to learn. Whereas people that don't really know much about a subject and never question anything and never look into anything, they think they know everything. And they take everything at face value and they think they're oh so smart. And that's an interesting part of what he's saying here. Rhett is saying that when I came to the realization that maybe I believe that macroevolution is true, what he's saying is it didn't just change that one portion of it. It rocked his entire belief system. That, oh my gosh, if I was wrong about this, how many more things could I be wrong about? If I was taught this my whole life by the people I'm supposed to trust and I believe they're wrong now, were they wrong about everything else as well? I mean, talk about an existential crisis. That's tough.
At that point, I realized how wrong I could be about something so fundamental.
Yeah.
And I never, ever considered that I might be wrong about something so fundamental. And then not only was I wrong, But all of these Christian apologists who were so sure about their critiques of evolution, they had missed the boat so significantly on this that suddenly I was like, can I trust anything else they've got to say about this?
Mm-hmm.
So that was the first big domino.
Yeah. It's significant, like you say. I mean, you might think.
Don't we all go through that with our parents as we grow up? I think every child, when they're young, they feel like their parents are superheroes and they know everything and they're the best thing in the world. And it happens at different times for each child, depending on their childhood. But for children in a good home, I think they often get to between like 16 and 20. And then maybe they get out in the world and they start experiencing some things for themselves, and they discover one or two things that they're like, wow, I think my parents were wrong on this. And then they get to a point where they're like, well, if they were wrong on this, what else are they wrong about? And you start to lose all faith in your parents. For anyone who's in that situation, if you're the parent, I'll tell you right now, as the child, they eventually come around. So don't panic.
Anything else they've got to say about this? So that was the first big domino.
Yeah. It's significant, like you say. I mean, you might think, well, there are Christians who believe in evolution, but it depends which way you come at it. I mean, if you're somebody who's like a scientifically minded person who comes to faith in Jesus, you're not going to abandon evolution, but you might think, okay, I can make this all work. But if you've come from the background you've come from, it's like going up to your wife and saying, I just think maybe we should like live in separate houses or something. And your wife's...
This brings me back to what we were talking about originally. Teach your children to think for themselves. Teach them to question things and teach them to do it right without rebellion. Because if you don't, when they grow up and they go out in the world and they find one or two little things that they find out they were wrong on, it will rock their entire faith, their entire world, everything they ever believed in. And they could abandon everything they grew up on. Where if you can teach them to think for themselves and you can teach them to explore those things at a young age, one, they can get used to, the feeling of, well, maybe I was wrong about this, but, that doesn't mean I have to abandon everything that I believe in. Or it can give them solid reasons and ways to defend themselves so that when they go out in the world, they're not just blindly accepting, like Rhett here, well, just, macroevolution didn't happen. It's just not true. That's what I was taught. But he never had any, it sounds like, any discussions or teachings or research on it as a young man. So when he was faced with an opposing opinion that he sought out himself later in life, when he found out that he felt in that moment that he was wrong, everything he believed in was shattered. His world was rocked.
Yeah, it's like going up to your wife and saying, I just think maybe we should like live in separate houses or something. And your wife starts bawling and someone says, hey, I don't really know. Some people do that. Some married couples, they live apart and stuff. It's like, yeah, but what it represents to move from where we are now and the way we were living to having this kind of question or this kind of desire indicates a direction of thought.
Yeah.
Which you don't really want to entertain.
Wow, what an interesting video. What do you guys think about this? Let me know in the comments below. Do you disagree with what they're saying? Have you had a similar experience to Rhett? Please go and support Alex. Please go support Rhett and Good Mythical Morning. These guys, regardless of whether they believe in what you believe or they don't, I believe that they're great guys and they deserve your support. Thanks for coming around to the channel today, guys. Let me know what you want to see next time in the comment section. If you want to support me, slap that subscribe button, hit that like button. And if you want to suggest and watch reactions live, head over to Twitch and go to Thomas_Shade. Give your mom a hug for me.